Hi, I'm Gregory V. Deal. I'm a business and personal development author, and today I'm going to tell you about the most important intellectual influence in my life and a series of books that just might continue to change my life. When I was 21 years old, way back in the year 2009, I met a very old man named John Pugsley. He was about 75 when I met him, and it was 2 years before he died. John, I learned, had been an economist and an author on economics, popular way back in, I think, the 70s, like 10 years before I was even born. Well, John turned out to be a very influential man on me and introduced me to a lot of ideas I had never considered about how the world worked. And in particular, he introduced me to a recording of a lecture series by Andrew Galambos called the V-50 lectures. V stands for volition. And over the course of several hours, I learned to look at the history of scientific discovery very differently as a result of the things I learned in that lecture series. And I learned how to apply scientific methodology to everything in the world. It was kind of like opening my mind to the idea that science isn't just an accumulation of facts you learn in school and things you have to memorize to pass a test. It's a way of seeing the world where you can verify and corroborate and test everything you think is true. And if you have an accurate working worldview, everything should be consistent within it. In a manner of speaking, it gave me the confidence to trust in my own assessment of how things work, even if virtually everyone around me disagreed with me or insisted that things have to work a certain way. I learned to trust that my mind was capable of determining through scientific methodology what actually made sense and was consistent with what was known to be true. So I guess you could say that the V-50 lecture series was probably the single most important intellectual influence on my young life at the time, and it definitely encouraged this burgeoning passion for science and understanding the world that was certainly already there before, but it kind of coalesced and integrated it into a much more potent force in my life and taught me what to do with it. So naturally, after I finished the V-50 lectures multiple times, I wanted to know, well, what else has this guy, Andrew Galambos, done? He died back in the 90s, okay, but apparently he was an active lecturer for a couple decades, I think, or at least 10 years in the 60s. So what else did he produce besides this one lecture series? And what I learned was that the vast majority of everything he ever lectured on was not published. And for very complicated reasons that I don't still fully understand to this point, but that seem to involve a lot of people who were in charge of his intellectual estate screwing up the publication of his work, virtually none of anything he ever did throughout his entire teaching career was made available to the public. That was 15 years ago. I'm 36 now. It's the year 2025. Well, imagine my surprise when it came to my attention that just recently, not all of Andrew Galambos' work, but what is considered to be the continuation of the V-50 lecture series that I listened to and his most important work called V-201 was recently published as a 15-volume book set comprising almost 8,000 pages in total under the title Sic Itur Ad Astra, which is Latin for "This is the way to the stars." And I've just started getting into it. I just received these this week. And the subject of these books can be summarized as how to teach humanity how to build a civilization in line with universal scientific principles, which includes, but is not limited to, solving the problems pertaining to non-sustainable economics, government, and ecology, basically everything related to sustaining human life on this planet, and in line with the ambition of the lecturer, the creator, Andrew Galambos, who worked in astrophysics, create a society even capable of becoming interplanetary and one day intergalactic. Basically, a sustainable way of having a human civilization in line with scientific principles by understanding social causality. That sounds like a very exciting topic, I'm sure, to most people. Well, as I dive into this trove of information over the next few months, at the very least, that's going to take me to read this, I would like to review and summarize what I learn, and hopefully encourage other people who, like me, I never would have heard of this guy if it hadn't been for one person whose opinion I trusted, a very, very old man who I only knew for a couple of years, but who was a very strong mentoring influence on me. If he had not endorsed the views covered in this course so strongly, I never would have had a reason to. So hopefully I can pass on some of that endorsement now to other people like me who I would say are struggling to make sense of the mess of the world that they live in. Because I was always the kind of guy who needed things to make sense, and they didn't. I looked at the world around me, and nothing about how human beings had come to organize and establish the world on virtually any scale of operation did not make sense to me. And nobody whose opinion I trusted, no authority figure, no social leader could explain it to me in a way that made sense until I was exposed to the ideas of Andrew Galambos. So if that sounds like you, I encourage you to take my endorsement and look into what has been published here as Sic Itur Ad Astra from Spaceland Publications. Currently, there is the introductory lectures available on Amazon, just as the basic course of the volitional sciences, 3-session introduction. Volition in this context, of course, means the ability to choose. It's the creator's way of saying this is the science of how human beings make choices, and that's what eventually leads to the development of everything we call civilization. Billions of human beings at this point, independently making choices in a collective attempt to meet our best interests and create some kind of social structure that works out for everyone. That's where we get the term volitional science.
Do you want to share the things inside the books one by one? Or
no, it will take days. I feel like I'm finally going to be intellectually challenged in ways that I rarely am, which is not to say like that I think I'm the smartest person in the world, because I do read a lot of books. A lot of them I can't even understand because I don't have enough training. And like I recently read a book on neuroscience, which I found very interesting. I'm not a neuroscientist, so I can't say I understood all of it, but the parts I did understand were very interesting, right? So that challenged me certainly, but not in a way that I think I particularly was passionate enough about. I think that's the missing ingredient. There's a subject I'm particularly passionate about, and it's incredibly difficult to find adequate resources to stimulate me and teach me about this subject. And I guess, for lack of a better term, that's the science of human civilization, which is how Andrew Galambos thought of it, right? And it's also very, very hard for me to find someone who can explain things in a way my mind considers adequate, because the vast majority of people, even if they're an expert on a subject, have something called the curse of knowledge bias, where it's very difficult for them to understand, to remember what it's like not to know all the specialized things they know. So most of their attempts, even people who write very successful books, it just mostly comes across as, well, here's how it works. Done. As opposed to taking you through step by step the process of discovery, how we figured out that something works that way, what premises you have to know before these other conclusions make sense, and logically how every single piece of data in this field fits together like a jigsaw puzzle, right? And I don't know if he was like just had some crazy form of neurodivergence or something, but part of the reason that these books take up almost 8,000 pages is because he does that. He goes into pedantic detail at every little goddamn thing he's talking about, which I think might drive most readers insane. But to someone like me, it might be adequate if he just said, well, here's how it is. Okay, thanks for informing me. But instead, he'll say, here's how it is. Now, here's a few interesting anecdotes throughout history that demonstrate the point I'm making. Here's the process all the scientists and discoverers who came before me went through to arrive at this conclusion. And here's how we can even prove that this conclusion is true now, even in a modern context. Now that you understand that and that you are 100% sure of this thing that I've explained to you, here's all the other things that we can now know to be true because we've accepted that this one obscure thing that I just told you is also true. You see what I mean? Very, very few people can do that. It requires a mind that it's like a Wikipedia mind. You have to see how everything you know connects to everything else that you know. And that's a very rare ability. I think it's the type of ability certainly that I try to hone in my own writing, though I don't think I'm nearly as good as Andrew Galambos was maybe one day. But that is the kind of feedback that I've gotten even on my own books, that when people read something I write, regardless of the subject, very often I've gotten feedback like, I took a whole college course on this, and just in this one chapter, you explained it better than they did in 4 years, right? Because like you actually explained how we know every single piece of information that you're talking about. It's not just presented as, here's how it is, enjoy. So that's very appealing for the type of, I don't know, obsessive, pedantic networking mind that I have. Like, I have to see how all information fits together. I can't just accept conclusions in a vacuum. So that's probably why I'm so excited to read such a geeky, nerdy, in-depth take on such an important subject, because I don't know anyone else who can explain it in that level of precision and detail. It will teach you how to think about things in a new way, all things beyond just the subject of the lectures themselves. It will hopefully, like, okay, remember the other day I said to you, you were asking me some very innocent question about the United States government or something. Mm-hmm. And before I even attempted to answer your question, I said, what do you mean when you say that word? And you looked a little stunned, like, what do you mean? What do I mean? I said, well, you're asking me a question that has at least 2 or 3 terms that you're going to have to give me a detailed explanation of before that question means anything, and therefore before any answer I could give you might mean something. And then I said to you, no matter what you're talking about, if you can define the key terms you're using, that will make you twice as smart as anyone else on that subject, because the vast majority of people cannot define and elaborate exactly what they mean when they say certain things, because they're just mostly unconscious at the repeating things they've heard other people say without actually analyzing, what do these words mean? What do they have to do with reality? And what is the actual question I'm asking here, right? That's the kind of thing you learn in the V-50 lectures, like how to do that with everything. Which again sounds a little bit insane and obsessive, but for a certain type of person, it's like therapy or something. It's like, I'm not crazy. Like, this is how you actually learn things. This is how you actually put knowledge together in a competent structure, right? You don't just repeat words that you heard someone else say. You actually have to come up with meaningful definitions for these things, a way of demonstrating that they make sense and that they're true. That's scientific methodology. Can you do that with everything? Or there are some things that can't be scientifically thought of or tested. If you really listen to what Galambos is talking about, well beyond just whatever specific subject he's talking about, it really does change the way you think about your own thoughts and the way you see the world. Like, a question he asks throughout the lectures, and that you will probably find yourself asking a lot when you are done with the lectures, is, how do you know you're right? Seems like a very basic question, right? How do I know I'm right about that? Everything you think, right? So first we talk about just precisely defining what you're talking about, right? And using those definitions consistently. But then whenever you make any kind of claim whatsoever about what's real, about reality, can you work backward and figure out, how did I arrive at that conclusion? Where did those thoughts come from? Somebody must have told me that was true at some point, but how do I actually know that that's right? It's epistemology, essentially, like the origins of knowledge, of discovery. And you find that, of course, that many of the things that you think are right were just taken on faith, essentially. You read them in a book somewhere, somebody taught you them in school, your parents told you, or somebody you respect told you. And that's fine as a way to get introduced to knowledge, just as hopefully I'm introducing you to some knowledge right now, but it can't be the basis by which you accept something as a true conclusion and then use it to form other ideas about what's true. And so if you're willing to put in the work into obsessively investigating your own thoughts, your own worldview and paradigm, over time, you start to kind of prune away the leaves in your mind that aren't really going in a direction that makes any sense. Or occasionally, you even need to cut down a whole goddamn tree, if we're using a tree as an analogy for thoughts, meaning that perhaps many of the things you think about a particular subject, your entire worldview or paradigm about something, is fundamentally flawed. It was originated, it grew, it sprouted out of something that someone convinced you was true without any real evidence or reason to accept it as true. And when that happens, you can't just be content with pruning some of the details, the leaves. You have to cut the whole tree down and replace it with something planted in good soil. And I think that kind of thinking scares a lot of people, particularly as they get older. I think I was fortunate that I was first exposed to this way of thinking when I was 21, because I was very hungry for knowledge. I was very unsatisfied with the sources of knowledge available to me. I think that's what John Pugsley saw in me when I met him, and he immediately recognized you'd get a lot from this lecture series because you seem very frustrated with everyone's explanations of how the world works. So I thank him for that, beyond the grave. Thanks, John. And I think a lot of people, if they were older, even in their 30s or beyond sometimes, you know, if you tried to convince them to reassess everything they've accepted as true, or even not even necessarily say that it's wrong, but at least think about how you know that it's right, it'd be a terrifying proposition for most people, because you've spent an entire life forming a belief system, a worldview, a sense of identity based on things that you might, if you were intellectually honest and really rationally inquired into, realize don't actually make that much sense, right? And maybe if you'd grown up in a completely different part of the world or a completely different time period, you'd have come to completely different conclusions. And that's a really scary thought for some people, I think, because they really want to believe that the way they see things is like somehow permanent and ingrained and fundamental to who they are. And if instead it's just some random assortment of ideas that you happen to pick up through the act of living, it's like, well, who am I then? If all these things that I thought were true, or I thought were important to me, turn out not to be true, and I really rationally delve into them, what's left? Well, what's left is you and your ability to determine what's true. There's still a you underneath all that. And now if you are an intellectually curious person and dedicated to understanding the truth as much as humanly possible, this lifelong journey you have to go on is figuring out how to piece together a rational and consistent worldview, even if you have to do it from scratch and throw away everything you once thought to be true. That's the kind of impact these lectures and these books have on you. I don't know anything else that does that.